Picture this. A single missile launches. Every radar within range lights up. Operators scramble. Systems initialize. And then, on the descent, something unexpected happens. One missile becomes many, not two, not five. Around 20 separate objects, spreading across a wide area simultaneously. Now ask yourself, how many interceptors does that force you to fire? And what happens the second time? The 40th? That question is not hypothetical. It is the exact scenario keeping military planners awake right now. And by the end of this video, you will understand why this single weapon concept doesn't just threaten buildings. It threatens the entire financial logic of modern defense. Because this isn't a story about missiles. It's a story about math. And the math is not on the defender's side. Here is the brutal claim up front. The future of regional war is not decided by who has the biggest bomb. It is decided by who can bankrupt the enemy's defense inventory faster than they can replenish it. One side spends $1 million per launch, the other spends 10 times that trying to stop it. Run that math over 100 launches, and you don't need a winner on the battlefield. You already have one on the balance sheet. But before we get into how that breaks down, I need to anchor you in a number that reframes everything you're about to hear: $348 trillion. That is the current estimate of total global debt, not US debt, global debt. Every government, every interceptor battery, every air defense network, all of it operating inside that financial environment. Defense spending isn't free money. It competes with interest payments, social stability, and the cost of keeping governments functional. That backdrop matters enormously, and I'll come back to it. So what exactly is this one becomes many concept? It's not magic and it's not rumor. What recent reporting describes is a ballistic missile warhead that, during descent, disperses roughly 20 submunitions across a wide footprint. These aren't 20 independent guided missiles, but that almost doesn't matter. Because from the defender's perspective, you now have multiple objects in the air simultaneously, each one demanding a tracking decision, an engagement call, and potentially an intercept attempt. Here's what makes it genuinely devious. You can destroy the missile body, but if the dispersion happens before your intercept, you haven't solved the problem. You've just started it. The objects are already falling, your operators are already saturated, and your inventory is already draining. One launch, dozens of decisions. Somewhere in that chain, the system starts to crack. Now, this is not new. This is a pattern, and it has repeated throughout modern history with disturbing consistency. One side builds an expensive defense architecture. The other side introduces a multiplier. The architecture slowly becomes a countdown clock instead of a shield, and the world resets around new rules. 4 stages. They repeat whether the weapon is a V-1 rocket, a Scud, or a cluster warhead ballistic missile. Stage 1. A security architecture is built. It is rational. It is expensive. The public gets used to safety as a default. Nobody talks openly about the limits, because admitting limits destroys confidence, and confidence is the entire point. Stage 2. The architecture expands beyond what it can realistically sustain. More sites, more threats, more interceptors used for more scenarios. And because the system must appear to work perfectly, it becomes politically unable to admit when it doesn't. The gap between what the system can do and what it's promised to do starts widening, quietly. Stage 3. The attacker introduces a multiplier: mass, saturation, decoys, submunitions. The goal is no longer to hit one target. The goal is to force disproportionate spending per incoming object until inventories strain, decision cycles stretch, and defense starts to leak. Not catastrophically, just enough to be noticed. Stage 4. The rules reset, not through negotiation, through cost. The defender changes doctrine, changes posture, changes political commitments, or escalates offensively to eliminate the launch source. Markets reprice risk, alliances quietly narrow. The world looks different on the other side. That's the mechanism. Now let me prove it with 3 case studies, and watch how the same 4 stages play out each time, almost frame for frame. The Cold War MIRV problem is the clearest version in its purest form. Early in the nuclear era, missile defense felt achievable. Track the warhead, intercept it, protect the city. The logic was seductive. Governments began building toward it. Radars, command networks, interceptor systems. The promise spread, and then the attacker introduced a multiplier. MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. One missile, multiple warheads, plus decoys, plus penetration aids designed to confuse discrimination. Suddenly, the defender wasn't asking, "Can we stop a missile?" They were asking, "Can we afford to fire interceptors at every object that might be a warhead? Every time? Forever?" The honest answer was no. And so the entire strategic logic shifted, not because everyone became peaceful, because the cost-exchange ratio became mathematically undeniable. Defense against offense was unsustainable at scale. The world pivoted toward deterrence through second strike capability. The doctrine changed not out of wisdom, but out of arithmetic. The reset happened through math, not diplomacy. Now fast forward to 1991, the Gulf War, and a lesson that most people got completely wrong. Coalition forces entered with overwhelming technological confidence, air superiority, precision strikes, modern logistics. Then Iraq started firing Scud missiles. Imprecise, outdated, arguably ineffective in any traditional military sense. So why does it matter? Because the Scud wasn't trying to win battles. It was trying to win attention. Every launch forced sirens, evacuations, disrupted coalition politics, and demanded interceptor responses. Patriots were deployed. The public was told the shield was working. A psychological contract formed. We are protected. And here's the trap that contract created. The attacker now controlled the defender's spending behavior. If you've told the public the shield works, you cannot stop firing interceptors. Every incoming Scud, even if militarily trivial, had to be engaged. The attacker had found a way to reach into the defender's budget and pull out money on demand. The lesson absorbed into doctrine afterward was brutal in its simplicity. Missile defense is never only about physics. It is about politics, credibility, and cost. And the next generation of planners learned the deeper point. You don't need to defeat the shield in one dramatic moment. You drain it, confuse it, and exploit it until it leaks. Remember that phrase, drain it until it leaks. Now, move to Ukraine. Because this is where that lesson becomes industrialized. Cheap drones and ballistic missiles fired in mixed salvos against the same defense network, simultaneously. A $50,000 drone triggering the same intercept decision as a multi-million-dollar ballistic missile. The defender system cannot easily distinguish between them during flight. It must react to every track. This forced the most corrosive question in modern air defense. Do you spend an expensive interceptor on a cheap drone to protect morale? Or do you conserve it and accept the psychological damage of watching something burn on television? There is no good answer to that question. The attacker knows it. The conflict became an industrial race. Who can manufacture interceptors fast enough to keep the defense alive? And that race exposed a structural truth nobody in Western defense circles wanted to say out loud. High-end systems were not designed for this volume, at this tempo, sustained indefinitely. Saturation beats perfection. Multiplication beats invincibility. Now bring all three of those case studies back to the present, because here is where it gets uncomfortable. Iran holds what analysts widely describe as the largest ballistic missile inventory in the Middle East. Its doctrine isn't built around one spectacular strike. It's built around persistent pressure, mass, and the strategic exploitation of the defender's cost curve. Missiles and drones are not backup weapons in that doctrine. They are the primary instrument of political signaling. And now that doctrine has a new feature. A warhead that turns one missile into a saturation event. Think about what that does to the defender's calculus. You no longer know on detection whether you're facing one threat or 20. You can't wait to find out, because the dispersion may already be happening. You have to react to the worst case, every single time. That is how you drain a defense system without ever destroying it outright. You make it spend at maximum rate on every inbound track. And here's where the 348 trillion comes back. Every interceptor fired represents procurement budget. Every procurement budget competes with interest payments, domestic priorities, and the political cost of asking parliaments to approve more defense spending in an era of record debt. The defender isn't just running out of missiles, they are running out of political will to keep replenishing them at the required pace. The attacker doesn't need to win the battle. They need to make the battle too expensive to fight indefinitely. That is the real explosion. Not the one in the sky, the one on the balance sheet. So what does Stage 4 look like this time? There are exactly 4 ways this resets, and none of them are comfortable. The first path is industrial. The defender invests massively in cheaper, more scalable interception. Directed energy weapons, lower-cost point defense, electronic warfare that jams guidance rather than kinetically destroys. This is a decade-long path that requires sustained investment that current dead environments make politically very difficult. The second path is offensive. The defender stops playing the interception game and starts targeting the launchers themselves, striking production nodes, storage facilities, launch infrastructure. This path is shorter in time. It is also escalatory by nature. Every strike against sovereign territory reopens every question about thresholds and what comes next. The third path is political contraction. Quietly, without announcement, some defended sites become less defended, some promises become softer, some allies are told privately that the umbrella has limits. This is the most invisible reset, but the most consequential, because entire alliance architectures are built on the belief that the shield is real. The fourth path is negotiated restraint, not peace, not goodwill, a shared recognition that the system is approaching a threshold where a miscalculation becomes catastrophic, and a mutual interest in preventing that outcome without either side admitting weakness. That is not a treaty. That is controlled friction masquerading as stability. None of these paths leave the current architecture intact. Now, the same 3 myths keep appearing whenever this conversation happens, and they are distorting people's thinking. The first myth is that exceptional military power makes you immune to this arithmetic. It doesn't. The arithmetic doesn't care about your flag. If defense requires constant spending and the attacker can multiply targets faster than you can multiply interceptors, the system strains, regardless of how advanced it is. Superior technology narrows the gap. It does not close it permanently. The second myth is that economic optimism will absorb the shock. A missile-driven risk premium doesn't stay on the battlefield. It moves immediately into shipping rates, insurance pricing, energy market volatility, and investment decisions across the region and beyond. In a debt-heavy global environment, that transmission is faster and more painful than most comfortable chairs allow people to admit. The third myth is that the next technological breakthrough will save us. Technology cuts both ways. It gives defenders better sensors and faster intercept cycles. It gives attackers cheaper manufacturing, better submunition dispersal, and improved saturation design. The side that wins is never the side with the fanciest technology. It is the side with the best scalable cost curve. So what do you actually do with all of this? Stop watching for the big strike. War in this model is not a movie climax. It is an inventory story. The real signal is not the explosion you see on screen. It is the interceptor stockpile you don't. When officials start discussing resupply timelines, prioritization of defended sites, or cost per intercept, that is the intelligence. That is the actual story. Watch for doctrine language. The moment you start hearing phrases like degrading launch capacity, striking production nodes, or preemptive offensive operations, you are no longer in stage 2 or 3, you are in stage 4. The system is already rebuilding around new rules, and that shift, when it happens, happens fast. Understand what this means for the world you live in. Instability in this mechanism doesn't stay regional. It moves through energy prices, shipping disruptions, and the confidence calculus of every investor, insurer, and supply chain manager watching the same events you are. A defense system leaking is not an abstract military problem. It is a cost of living problem, a portfolio problem, a stability problem for every government functioning inside $348 trillion of global debt. Here is the sentence to carry out of this video. The missile is not the main event. The cost curve is the main event. The cost curve is what forces empires to change doctrine, change posture, or change promises. And once a promise changes, once the security guarantee that an entire region's political order was built on starts softening, everything downstream of that promise gets repriced. That is not a prediction. That is already in motion. And if you want to understand what comes next, how inventory exhaustion becomes geopolitical leverage, how escalation ladders form when defense credibility is questioned, and how the strategic architecture of the region reconstructs itself once the old promises become untenable, subscribe, because that is exactly what the next video maps out. The pattern is already in motion. The only question is whether you see it before it sees you.